Welcome to the Natasha Helfer Podcast. To help keep this podcast going, please consider donating at natashahelfer.com and share this episode. You can find Natasha on Facebook at Natasha Helfer, LCMFT, CSTS, and at Natasha Helfer MFT on Instagram and TikTok. You can find all her cool resources at natashahelfer.com. The intro and outro music for this episode is by Otter Creek. This podcast was edited by Ashley Pacini.
Hello, everybody. This is Natasha Helfer. I am the host of the Natasha Helfer podcast, and we are always excited to dismantle shame through stories, education, all kinds of stuff, research, whatever we can bring to the table. And today I have my providers from Symmetry Solutions that are coming in for a panel. We try to do this once a month to just kind of look at the topics of the day, what's going out there in mental health land and faith transition land and sexual health land, and bring you some information kind of from our perspectives. So with me, I have Michelle Peets from Salt Lake City, Utah, and Jenny Elledge, who lives in Florida and is licensed both in Florida and in Utah for therapy practice. And I'm super excited to have you both with me. Hello.
Hello, hello.
Hello.
Nice to have you. All right. So we're going to start off by talking about finances. And you think, well, what do finances have to do with mental health? But the SEC, which is the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission, charged the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and its investment companies for disclosure failures and misstated filings. It was a $5 million fine, which, sounds like a lot of money to most of us, I think. I think for organizations as large as this church, it's really not that big of a deal, probably. And that's part of, I think, some of the critiques that are coming out is whether or not the fine was sufficient. Yeah, why would we be talking about this from a mental health perspective? So I'm going to just kind of open it up for discussion. Like, is this something that has been coming up in our sessions over the last few weeks? This was disclosed in February, like end of February. I think it was February 21st that this came out. So what's been the fallout?
Yeah, it's been a big fallout. I mean, this made national news. So, clients in all pockets of the country have been making some commentary on this. And depending on where their relationship to the church is, probably mitigates the impact of that kind of story. They may not have even been aware of it. I've heard that. And also they may be super aware of it and following it quite intensely and listening to all kinds of other podcasts as well about what this all means, right? Because most of us are not necessarily involved in these upper level type of, financial filings and trying to figure out what it all means. So with the relationship between yourself and the church probably mitigates how this impacted you. And so the response that I have seen has been a little bit varied, from, oh, I didn't know, to I can't believe that this happened. How did this happen?
Yeah, I think I'm noticing that depending on what your relationship is to corporations or to the corporate world, a lot of times you see people who kind of grew up during the corporate boom, like of the 80s, 90s, who are saying, well, yeah, of course, the church is a corporation. Of course, they're going to kind of be money makers. Of course, they're going to function this way, who tend to think it's not as big of a deal sometimes, whether they're in or out of the church or somewhere along the spectrum of belief. There's kind of this like understanding of church as corporation. What I noticed in clients who are a little younger, say millennials or even Gen Z, who are already really wary of larger institutions and are facing kind of an existential crisis in their personal and professional lives of, the conversation you hear a lot of times is, oh, do I go work for, this large institution? Do I go work for the man kind of thing, especially post-pandemic where a lot of people left jobs, right? And there was like a lot of skepticism around larger companies and how they exploit people. This is kind of like one more thing that I think makes people kind of just trusting. And so it's almost not even like I mean, yes, it's a religious thing as well, but I think for some people it's more existential in terms of like, I don't even know how to associate with these larger corporations now, and can they even be trusted? Which on the mental health side of things doesn't resolve the issue of how do I show up in the world and connect myself to other people that's going to keep me socially safe as well as like financially safe. So it's kind of, what I've seen is it's kind of unleashed this like way bigger thing, even way beyond religion. That's like, what groups of people can I trust? And that's a really complex thing.
I mean, I don't know about you all, but has this come up? I mean, like the weeks after this came out, I almost feel like it was almost every session. I would say 90% of the sessions that I had after this disclosure, it came up in the, I wasn't asking about it, but it came up as part of, kind of, and of course, our practice, we work a lot with those who are going through faith transitions. We work with a lot of mixed faith marriages. So it affects a lot of different things, like, for example, in a mixed faith marriage, you may have one person who's trying to figure out how to defend the church or minimize maybe some of the impact, or are having their own upset feelings about this, but then not knowing how to disclose their feelings of discomfort in a space where they already feel like that relationship with the church is tenuous with their partner, right? Like, is their partner going to say, see, I told you, or, of course you should be upset about this. And so I'm seeing a lot of interesting dances in mixed faith marriages around this particular topic. I think it's also, interesting to see how the church responded. So, they had a statement come out that same day on their newsroom. And, they basically gave, I'd say like 3-4 short paragraphs kind of explaining what had happened. And the last sentence is, well, we affirm our commitment to comply with the law, even though that's really what they had not done. So they're kind of affirming a commitment that's now in question. They regret mistakes made and now consider this matter closed. So another part of the population that I've really noticed a response from are people who've been through the confession process in LDS world, who've been through the disciplinary process of LDS world, and who've also just been through worthiness interviews, which is pretty much everybody in LDS world, where very specific questions are asked, like, are you honest with your fellow man? Like, that's a very basic question that the church leaders have been asking its members for pretty much from the beginning, as far as I know. I don't know exactly when that question came to be historically, but honesty is a really big value that LDS folks have in regards to how they deal with their finances, how they deal with, their fellow man, how they deal with their businesses. And I remember, from a very early age, kind of feeling this pride as an LDS person that we're not like those other churches where there are financial scandals, right? We don't have this one pastor who's going to run away with all the money and isn't held accountable by the higher organization. I always felt very safe that my tithing monies and my fasting funds were, offered into this institution that was going to be very careful with how it managed its monies, and that there were many points of accountability, that there was the local person, who took the funds, but then that local person had to report to the stake person, who then had to report to the general church. There's it felt like there was lots of checks and balances. But then this is like, oh, like this is at the very top, that there's been some kind of agreement by top church leaders that this level of dishonesty is okay. And until the SEC said, oh, it's not. And I have several financial kind of people, like people who are in finance as my clients, who have very carefully, explained, like, sometimes people don't really know exactly all the runarounds of a profession. Like, for example, if we knew that a fellow therapist lost their license, we know that it takes a lot for a fellow therapist to lose their license. Like we know the process, we know the kinds of things that could have happened. We know the ethical ramifications or the guidelines that maybe were not, met. And so these people who are in the finance world who are talking to me, they're saying, if I would have done what the church had done, I'm a business owner and I run like a financial institution, or I run a financial investment firm, I would be in jail right now, and it would not be a fine. It would be like a criminal thing for this particular thing that happened. So the cognitive dissonance is just really, really hitting my clients. Like, first of all, it's not like, and me having been excommunicated, it would have been nice to go in and say, oh, I regret a few things and I consider the matter closed. Right. But I didn't get to do that. Most people who are in LDS land don't get to just go in and say, oh, thanks, Bishop, for that good advice. And I do regret some of my mistakes and I consider the matter closed. And thanks, we'll see ya. I'm going to try to do better from here. And so I think that that's another reaction that people are having when they themselves have been disciplined by the church or held accountable by the church. And now the church itself is not behaving in a way that it expects its own people to behave. And that causes a lot of feelings that come up in our sessions, like betrayal, grief, anger, righteous rage, indignation, confusion, sadness, distrust. Again, I think that so many people are managing these kinds of feelings regardless of where they're at on the spectrum. And even like you were talking about, Michelle, the people who maybe are more orthodox and can still compartmentalize some of these things and justify bad behavior, because we know that when we're invested in our family, in an organization, in a marriage where there's bad behavior, but there's a lot of investment, we tend to minimize that bad behavior. We try to explain it away. That's a very normal human part of the human condition. But even they are dealing with a cost that they may not be conscious about, but it definitely leads to that kind of compartmentalization or cognitive dissonance that is painful. That's what I'm seeing. Sometimes I feel like I get on a soapbox and I talk way too long, but
no, I love it. I love it. I have something else that I want to point out in what you were talking about, this phrase of mistakes were made. It makes me think of, there's a book called Mistakes Were Made, But Not By Me, by Carol Tavris and Elliot Aronson. And I really love it. And they basically go into detail about where did that line come from. It came from, I think, the Nixon administration, right? And the Watergate scandal. And that was kind of the statement that they made was mistakes were made. And how much the passive voice in that matters. That mistakes were made. There's no subject there to take accountability. Who made the mistakes? And so that became a really laughable phrase in a lot of ways of and so, couples started using mistakes were made, right? Kind of thing. Okay, yes, but who made the mistakes? And when you have a really big corporation like the church, it's kind of like, okay, who made the mistake, right? And so then to follow it up with something like, and we consider this case closed. Yeah, not only are they not taking accountability, but then they're saying, we consider it closed. We're not interested in discussing this further. It's a really strong statement around, we're not really interested in continuing this conversation and getting curious about it, because we don't even really see ourselves as the person who was problematic in the first place. So anyway, it's such interesting language.
Yeah, I think that's why we keep laughing every time we hear, oh, mistakes were made. It's like, oh, really? It's just sort of like, it is a laughable phrase. Like you couldn't imagine between any type of conflict between a husband and wife, closing the conversation. Mistakes were made. This conversation is now closed. We would be, as therapists, very interested as to why that phrasing is being used. It's like, what's going on here? This is not closed just because you say it is, right? Like, that's not good relationship health. In order to work through any type of conflict. So it's less about, well, maybe it's less about the mistake, but how they're handling this mistake. It's like, well, tell me about how this mistake came to be. How long have you been engaged in this sort of mistake? What were your goals? What were your intention? How do you feel about this? Do you feel remorse, or do you just sort of feel caught and then you're just moving on and adjusting? Like, there's lots of curious questions that can follow, but again, there's no discourse, which probably highlights, again, the relationship difference between you yourself as an individual to a corporation, and the power differential there. Like, the corporation is still holding its power versus you as an individual, where you as an individual doesn't have that same power. You cannot most likely do that in other relationships. You couldn't do that in a bishop's office with someone. You couldn't do that with a friend, right? So that's another highlighted thing that's happening. The power differential can feel very sucky as an individual.
I love that you're bringing up the ideas of power differentials. I think that's huge. And I do agree that in any other relationship, to just be say, okay, the conversation is done, I get to decide that, misses the point of that relational kind of dynamic. And it usually can only be said by the person who has the most power.
Yep.
And, and there's no, like, even in this, like, okay, we agree that there were some issues. We're committed to resolving them. And now, we consider the matter closed. How do you consider the matter closed in 3 weeks or a day? It was the day that it came out, right? How do you consider a matter closed that we all know is systemic? This is a systemic way that the church is doing their finances. This would take, like, I would think, months or years to really shift how they're doing business. We know just from running our little practice how much just one little change, like, do we want to start a new portal system, or do we want to, do this, that it would take weeks, if not months, to put anything into place that's going to systemically affect, the 10 of us who work together. Thinking of, a global church and organization that we know through a lot of the disclosures that have been happening financially, that this is a very complex, very well, run, very strategic financial kind of systemic plan that the church has had, that now has them, in the billions of dollars as far as wealth is concerned. How is that matter closed? Like, on the same day that the news came out, what have you done to systemically, actually, have this issue? I'm going to be really, kind of just very open. We just in the last month, we were affected by a data breach in our company due to the software that we were dealing with. And this is actually going to be, we're following all the protocols, right? This has been a huge thing of discussion between us and our clients and all kinds of things. It's going to be announced, I think, at the Salt Lake Tribune in a few days, that this happened through the council practice that we use for our data and our HIPAA compliant software. We have had to, like, write letters, and not that we have to, we want to. we have talked to lawyers, we have written letters, we have written all kinds of things to explain what exactly happened, how it happened, who it specifically affected, how many people were involved in that breach. The Department of Health and Human Services is involved, right? Like, all of these things to make sure people know, that people can trust, that people understand what we've done to rectify this mistake, which really wasn't even our mistake, but what the company is doing to rectify this mistake and make sure it never happens again. That was, like, just a small company, a small thing, and tons more things have happened, especially in our communication to those who were affected, than just this one sentence. Imagine if we would write our clients, well, we consider the matter closed and we regret mistakes and just trust us that this won't happen. That would be so, like, not appropriate and so harmful to the trust that we can gain or continue to have with people who, decide to work with our organization.
And notice that we led with the disclosure, right? We didn't wait around for someone to catch us, or not us, as counsel, catch the mistake that was made. And we led forward with, this is what happened, with explanation, what we're going to do to make amends, and ... It's really a counsel, not us.
Right. No, I agree. It's like, and we wanted to, we were desperate to get information out there so that people wouldn't be afraid, so that people would know what was happening, that people would understand, what the matter was and how it was being resolved. Like that just is basic trust building skills. Basic. Those are just basic. Right? They happen to be things that we also have to comply with the Department of Health and Human Services, but they're basic things. And yeah, it's funny that you talk, Michelle, about mistakes were made or whatever, because that's one of my kiddos' favorite things to say. It's like they'll come home and they'll be like, mistakes were made today. And it usually means that, they overspent money, or they, I don't know, they didn't study as much as they should have for their test, or whatever. Mistakes were made.
Yeah. I want to point out another power differential which is about money, right? So this is a large, systemic church, a large organized church with lots of wealth, who hid money in certain ways for whatever reason, yet are still engaging in a financial process where they're asking its members to tithe their own personal money to said organization, which is yet another power differential. Like, if you want to have exaltation, you need to be tithing money in this very specific way, and that tithing does not get to be spent wherever you like. It has to go back to the same organization or church, who is now being caught in this sort of financial dealing that the FCC says is unethical, illegal, whatever it is. And that can bring up a lot of feeling for people too.
Yeah, go ahead, Michelle.
Well, I mean, I was just thinking, as we're sitting here thinking about the process we've had to do to make sure, that we haven't, lost trust, and how much that landed on our nervous systems as just kind of this like, ooh, okay, how are we going to repair this thing that we were impacted by because of this failure of the software? It kind of makes me wonder, like, does the church hold that same kind of anxiety, like, in their collective nervous systems, and if so, what does that look like? Because for me, it was this idea of, okay, if I have a client who wants to talk to me about this, once they read the notification, like, I'm going to hold all the space in the world to talk about that, because that's far more important in our therapeutic relationship than maybe like the current thing that's presenting in their life that day. Like, we will get to that, but we can't even get to that or expect to have any kind of change occur in that person or in that space if that trust hasn't been reestablished. Like, everything runs off of that trust. And so it just makes me wonder, as a collective whole, how this feels in church leaders. And is this how they're kind of attempting to like to cope, I guess, with that anxiety of potential lost trust? And such an interesting way to deal with it.
Well, and I think this is something that, the church as a whole is really struggling with to begin with, right? I think it takes this position of, we are we are the church, right? We are the way back to God. We therefore have to keep up this kind of like, this veneer that we are perfect, we are wonderful, we would never do anything wrong. And so you see the church over and over again as it faces human error and mistakes and history and a variety of things that obviously, it's not this shiny, perfect thing, that it, instead of facing that in kind of a more humanistic way and being able to sit with the discomfort of its errors, because of course the church is really just a conglomeration of a lot of people, right, that are going to make a lot of errors and have a lot of different personalities. It's so afraid to do that because it would come down off of this pedestal of being the one and only right thing and almost godly in of itself, that it almost like bites itself and, shoots itself in the foot, right? Because we know that the things that elicit trust and that repair relationships are things like humility and accountability and transparency and dialogue and communication and lowering power differentials, right? Like trying to get on equal ground. And we see this too in like a lot of businesses, a lot of like even educational schools and public educations and universities. And you can see the entities that are trying to move more into that egalitarianism, kind of trust building, relationship centric dynamics versus the ones that are staying in kind of authoritarian, our way is the right way. You see this even in parenting, right? Like parenting techniques, parents who are very much like, you shall be, seen and not heard, and you have to follow us because we are the parents and we know best, versus parents who take a more flexible approach, not entirely democratic approach, right? Because obviously kids are kids, but a more democratic approach where a kid's thoughts and feelings are taken into account and they're kind of being invited into the family kind of dynamics that are seen as these entities that don't have any power or don't have anything worth offering. So these dynamics are kind of like system wide. And I think that the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is really having a hard time moving away from authoritarian, kind of we are up here type of entity versus really doing the work of its values, which really match more what we're talking about in a very different perspective. And that's hard. That's hard for the system, and that's hard for the people in the system to consistently be in that space.
You're making me think about, I think so often people's journeys as therapists, and I'll speak for myself, is that like early in my career, it was kind of like, oh, I need to project competence and kind of almost this like perfection. And I wouldn't have said that. I wouldn't have thought like, oh, I need to project perfection. But you're thinking, I need to be a certain way with my clients in order for them to trust me, in order for them to actually like be interested in anything I have to say or offer. And then you get further along and you start to realize, and I think this is the experience as a parent too, right? Is, oh, actually, I can be imperfect and I can express this to this person, this client, or if it's a child when you're a parent. And when I express that of, oh, I made a mistake and I am learning and I am growing myself as a therapist or as a parent, there's a sigh of relief that occurs in that client or in that child that's like, oh, you're not perfect too. Okay, all of a sudden I don't need to come to this session, or I don't need to show up with mom or dad or whoever in this perfect way all the time in order to be loved, in order for this to be a good relationship. Actually, the real power in this relationship is being able to show up in imperfect ways and take accountability and say, yeah, mom got mad today, right? Or, as a therapist, in my personal life, this thing happened. I kind of screwed up with my partner in this way. And then all of a sudden that totally changes the dialogue where that client or that child is like, oh, okay, let me actually tell you who I really am. And so I think for the church to carry this huge burden of, I need to project perfection in order for my membership to trust me and for me to have influence on them. Yeah, like you said, is a huge burden to carry, and one that they don't really need to carry. I think it's a really outdated idea. And I love watching when parents in particular go through faith transition and all of a sudden they're like, I don't have the answers. I don't have it all figured out. Oh my gosh, what are my kids going to think? They're looking to me to be like, to know all the answers, and for them to have that realization of, oh no, I don't need to, and I can actually fumble through this with them, and maybe that's actually going to inculcate trust more, is such a relieving thing. And I just, that's something I so wish the church could get on board with, because I think it'd be really relieving to them, so they don't have to make statements like mistakes were made and this is closed.
Yes. One last thing I'd like to just bring up from a mental health perspective with monies is I'm fairly comfortable saying that the way in which the church communicates with its members around the principle of charity, really, which is what tithing is about, is both spiritually and emotionally abusive, right? So this is when you have, a principle that is just not like, oh, this is something that we might think about doing and it's moral, and how are we all going to participate in not only, being self-sufficient, but we're also going to participate in being a wider part of the solution of financial well-being for our community and our communities, which I think is it's a valid thing that we should all be thinking about. But when you tie that to, well, but if you don't do it this particular way and in this particular amount, now your salvation is in question, your ability to participate in the community is, squashed, or, like you're not able to go to the temple or do these things that are very important in our belief system, you start creating an anxiety and even, potentially a depression when people don't feel like they can meet that standard. And what is extremely upsetting to me is how oftentimes these are conversations that are being had in spaces where people are very, are in poverty, are they themselves in abject poverty, because these kinds of lessons are being given in all parts of the world, regardless of, economic stability or country stability, or all those kinds of things. And oftentimes given in a way that is, this idea that if you can't feed your children, if you don't have enough food in your house, still give the tithes, because somehow, the Lord will provide, right? And usually how the Lord is providing is through the church system of, Bishop's Warehouse and kind of tithes and fast offerings. And so the person then has to go and talk with the leader about how they cannot feed their children, and would I be eligible, kind of like we do with governments, for WIC or for whatever. It's like, can I be eligible to receive these types of helps? And as a prior Relief Society president myself, sitting in a lot of these types of conversations with people and then advocating for people in like a ward council or in a bishopric, kind of meeting, that process is extremely humiliating. It's extremely humiliating. It's extremely, like, again, power differential. Well, we get to decide how you spend your monies, and are you spending money on this or are you spending money on that, before we would actually help you. And these are people that, for the most part, are doing the best they can. Financial management is very challenging. We're all living in very financially challenging times. Even those of us who are middle class struggle, right? Much less those who, are in poverty. And then to have these kinds of, and then to think like, okay, I wrote out my check for $25 and that could have meant a meal for my kids. And then to hear, oh, just like that, the church paid $5 million for a fine, when I'm trying to write my little check that is like hurting me and my family, and it's giving me anxiety and is making me maybe take on a second job, or I don't, and these anxieties that we know, financial anxieties, are things that we ruminate about and keep us up at night, and that are just at the pit of our stomach when we feel like, oh my gosh, these bills and I can't pay them, but I have to pay my tithing. I think there's just a real like disrespect and irresponsibility in how the church is talking about these kinds of matters with a wide variety of members, many of which don't really have quote unquote an income. They have a wage that is barely keeping them going. And it's not like this income that they're able to like plan for their future, or, plan for retirement or save. It's just like, what comes in is easily coming out, because so many people don't even have a living wage, in our country, much less many other countries. So this gets me kind of like riled up at a whole nother level. Is like, here I'm giving my monies, and we know already that the amount of money that the church gives to humanitarian aid compared to the money it has. It's not that the church doesn't give a lot of money to humanitarian aid, but when you do an analysis of comparison of percentage, that amount is really, really too small. I mean, it's less even than we're expected to give. I don't believe we give 10% of our wealth away as the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints to humanitarian aid. So here I am thinking, okay, well, I'll write my $20 because maybe that will go and help somebody, and I'm helping the Lord, when I think the Lord's church, quote unquote, is not even tithing correctly itself.
Yeah.
It's maddening. And I think that this really, really damages people's mental health on either side of the equation, either as tithe payers or when they come out, the rage that people have when they start recognizing some of these costs, and sadness and betrayal are just what go into what we consider religious trauma.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. I'm excited by the idea that there's kind of a rise in the number of financial therapists out there, these people who kind of double focus on both the financial aspect, like they specialize in that and might have a degree in finance, and then also have a dual degree in some type of therapy background, and are starting to merge those two fields because we're starting to understand just how much finances impact our mental health. And so I think it's just like, it's a really fitting time for us to see a rise in that when we're seeing when we're becoming aware as a society of how much finances just impact us on such a primal level.
Yeah. Well, we know that in the divorce literature, it's one of the primary reasons couples struggle, is financial management and difficulty and just the pain of all that, which of course in divorce makes it worse, but it's just, these are very, very difficult topics.
Yeah.
Okay. So moving on, we have just a few more things we want to talk about. So Salt Lake Tribune came out with a article, I think several articles, now I can't find it, but with Lisa Diamond, who is running a study, well, lots of studies at the University of Utah on social safety. And it came out that from this study, which I'm super proud to have been a little tiny part of, just as far as some of my clinical ideas around questions that should be asked, and et cetera. But it came out that nearly half of Utah women report feeling chronically unsafe. Chronically unsafe. And so that's really pretty stark. That's a pretty, stark thing. And how do we define social unsafety? It's really kind of more than just being in a negative environment. The way Lisa talks about this, Dr. Diamond, is that it's an absence of positive cues from people, cues that tell a person they're welcome, included, and protected. She's doing a lot of interesting research or work and understanding how, I think sometimes we think that we're born into this world like just super chill, like we're just born super chill. And then as things happen to us, then we become hyper or upset or hyper vigilant or traumatized. I love your kitty, by the way, behind you. But what Lisa's trying to explain to us is that no, we come into this world screaming, right? Like most babies are screaming, like they're already like, wow, this was really hard. Something happened here that was very uncomfortable. And we are immediately seeking for safety. We're immediately seeking for, am I going to be safe? So we're born hypervigilant. We're born trying to figure out if our environment is safe. And then once we are safe and comforted, then we can calm down, and then the baby sleeps and the baby, kind of is okay. So this idea that somehow we're going to go to therapy and get back to a pre-trauma state is really unrealistic, because we're kind of born traumatized. We're born hypervigilant. And so it's more about figuring out, okay, how do I create social safety in my environment, in my system? so that I can be, I can settle instead of having to be this hypervigilant person. So why would we have this issue come up in Utah, right? So I'm not sure that this wouldn't come up in a lot of communities. I think that social safety is something that we struggle with everywhere. At the same time, I think that in Utah in particular, we have a lot of marginalized populations, right? So we have a majority religion. If you're not part of that, if you feel like you're part of that religion, that can be a very kind of social safety space. But if you're not, if you're ostracized, and that was one of the questions that they actually asked, was what impact did religious shunning play? And it turned out that it was huge. It was a huge part. I know more data is going to be coming out of this study. So it's just very newly released. And so I think the implications of this study are going to be very large because they measured a lot of different things. But you also not just have a religious minority, you have a racial majority, right? So you have a primarily white population. So if you're BIPOC, how is that going to impact your sense of social safety in a state where it's not very inclusive in that way? And then of course you have LGBT folks, and what types of inclusivity is really happening in a state where the majority religion takes fairly strong stances that are very harmful to LGBTQ folks. And even the current laws, around restricting transgender care are going to be markers for social unsafety for many, many people who identify as trans women, non-binary people, etc. So yeah, I don't know what you want to say about this, but I think it's a fascinating study with very sad results.
Yeah, no, I was thinking about that as well as I read through the article, and she's talking about the effect of the ban of gender affirming care. And we didn't quite talk about this as something we were going to discuss today, but it's making me think about how they just installed this new president of BYU, who is known for having been kind of the one who had a huge impact on denying gender affirming care in language services at BYU. Was that last year? And I'm just like kind of replaying that comment that Elder Holland made to him of like, there are going to be cold-blooded decisions that you are going to have to make as a president. And I know there was a lot of chatter online about this of like, what is he getting at? Like, what is he talking about here? And is this like, is Elder Holland kind of saying to him, like, you're going to have to continue to make these decisions in terms of like denying services or being exclusive in some kind of way. And I just found it so fascinating that he even labeled it cold-blooded decisions, that it's like, that's just something you're going to have to do. And I think in general, we understand that leadership a lot of times is going to have to make some rough decisions. And they can't always just, I don't know, meet everyone's needs. But labeling it cold-blooded just really goes against the feeling in this article of what Lisa's trying to get at here, which is top priority in building any kind of community should be making people feel safe.
And you think, what other communities would we want that more at than for our emerging adult people, in university settings, which of course then we'll just keep on going. Southern Utah University chose Elder Holland as their commencement speaker. So here's a religious, person who's being brought into a public school where there are a variety of diverse students, many of whom are LGBTQ+. And you're telling me that these people are going to have to sit in a space with a person who just within a few years ago talked about bringing musket fire, even if that was, allegorical, whatever, to standing up against these people's very identities. I mean, to me, that is just astronomically, I'm just flabbergasted. I'm kind of flabbergasted. I'm always surprised when I'm flabbergasted because you think by now I wouldn't be that flabbergasted anymore, but I'm flabbergasted. And think about the social safety in that setting where you're sitting in a space where you've paid money, where you've gotten your adult education. You may not even be LDS or Mormon at all. You may, and yet you're having to listen to a leader who is considered important enough and revered enough to come speak at your university, who directly makes your social safety null and void. Shocking to me. I don't understand how I think there are some revolts going on down there. I'm not exactly sure what everybody's doing but imagine having to like boycott your own commencement ceremony because you can't, or just not going. How many people just not go because even though they're not making a stance, they're so like triggered by this that it's just not safe to go to their own commencement speech, ceremonies, graduation celebrations, a moment where we're supposed to celebrate people of all the people who attended that university, many of whom are LGBTQ plus. Oh, Michelle.
Yeah.
Do we ever get tired? The ongoing ridiculousness of all the things that, I think like I always come back to life is hard enough, right? Like life gives you plenty of issues of why you might be depressed, why you might be traumatized, why you might be anxious, why you might be scrupulous or, OCD, like life just in general, just normal life. But then we as groups of people add unnecessary tragedy, unnecessary blocks, unnecessary, walls that just exacerbate and cause so many more problems than we would just have to face just in general, just facing the elements, just facing the fact that I've got a leak in my backyard because of all the snow. Like that's stressful enough. Do I have to, on top of it, worry that my commencement speaker thinks that, I don't deserve to exist?
Yeah. Yeah.
Very, very difficult. Okay, so we'll be following up with a lot of what comes up out of that study. Very fascinating. The study is still open for those who want to take it, I believe. And I do have those links somewhere. I'll try to find them and add them to the notes of this podcast. One quick little thing too, we've got about 5 minutes left. So there was yet another kind of horrific domestic violence report coming out of Colorado that included an LDS man poisoning his wife. I don't know even if I really want to get into much of the details. I want to be very clear that domestic violence happens in all communities, in all spaces, in all countries, in all cultures. It's an epidemic, that I think needs to be consistently talked about, and resources and, how are we going to address these kinds of things. The main reason why I want to talk about it here, though, is that I do believe, and I saw this a lot when I lived in Wichita, Kansas as well, kind of with evangelical communities and born again communities and Christian communities, that there seems to be what do I want to say? Like when a confidence, like a false sense of confidence in communities like this, that this couldn't happen with us because we're good people, right? Religious people, right? It's kind of like these ideas of who religious people are. We're good people. We're moral people. We have all these values, right? Like we talk, we hear in general conference or in other addresses or sermons that we shouldn't be abusive and that we should be loving and that we should follow Christ. And so that must happen elsewhere. That must happen elsewhere. That doesn't happen with us. And, I don't know if I can say, it happens actually more in religious communities or whatever. I mean, obviously, most people in the United States still consider themselves religious in some way or another, and domestic violence is still a huge issue. So I guess we just want to talk about how religion is not necessarily a protective factor here.
Yeah.
And in fact, I think it can be a danger if you have that sense of false security, of trusting either people you're going to marry, pastors, bishops, babysitters, people in your community that you feel like, oh, you must be safe because you belong to this in group that I'm a part of. I think that that's what we want to draw attention to.
Absolutely. I remember the moment I realized that the church had similar divorce rates to the rest of the world, basically, and the rest of the country, and just the dissonance that created in my mind of like, oh, yeah, we aren't set up for, better success if you consider, staying married a sign of success. I mean, that's a different discussion. To feel like, yeah, I am not protected, nor am I kind of better off or better set up for safety because I'm in this community. In fact, maybe it carries its own dangers and risks. It's kind of a hard thing to chew on, especially because there are a lot of people who do join the church based off that perceived safety that maybe they're seeking, that maybe they didn't get to experience in their own homes. So yeah, it's a really difficult topic, but I completely agree with you that it's important to be able to recognize you are not immune to this. Like every society out there, religious or not, has to grapple with these issues.
To grapple with these ideas that sometimes in religious communities, because kind of like even what we were talking about with the financial issues, there's this importance of coming across as good and right and righteous. Problems can be ignored, or even worse than ignored, like actually like explicitly, intentionally covered up. And I know that you and I, and probably every mental health therapist out there, can share a story where a person in a religious community went to get help from a leader and was dismissed or minimized, or actually told to just forgive and forget, or actually explicitly told not to bring certain charges, because what would that do to the family or the church or the reputation or the well-being of other people that wasn't the victim? And so I think that there is, and I see this even in our legal system, where there has to be a lot of proof, it seems like, to get a restraining order, right? Or to be taken seriously, that if there hasn't been some kind of prior history, it's hard to keep people even legally accountable for the safety of somebody who feels unsafe. So the reality is that many, many spouses, primarily female, but there are male, spouses too, that are, victims of domestic violence, that it's very hard to know how to even get the help that you want, because the systems are not really supporting that help. They're more like supporting the reputation of the larger entity, which would look bad if we have, something as awful as domestic violence happening in our midst.
Yeah.
So that's another thing that I think raises the risk for people in these religious communities.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think it'll be interesting to see where this goes, because I was talking to someone a few months ago who is in charge of a relatively large nonprofit that does a lot of work overseas. And one of the main things that they focus on is they're trying to kind of decrease rates of domestic violence in these developing countries. And they oversaw the department in their organization where sexual misconduct was occurring. And eventually they kind of came to tell me, we've kind of refocused on sexual misconduct between our employees and the beneficiaries of the organization, and how difficult that was to turn the focus on themselves and say, okay, this is happening within our organization, and we are perpetrating this exact thing that we're trying to eradicate in these countries that we claim to serve. And so I think the same with the church, right? Is that the church would love the idea of being able to kind of eradicate or decrease the level of abuse within, couples, within families that are members of their church. But in order to do that, they're going to have to look within themselves and start taking that seriously of where are we kind of perpetrating this as well with church leaders towards members? That's such a hard shift to make. it's much easier to just kind of say, don't do this in your families and don't do this in, your relationships. But yeah, to like first model it themselves. It'll be interesting to see where that goes.
Yeah. And I mean, obviously there's been article after article after article of, LDS men in particular that are either involved in domestic violence or sexual abuse, or, I mean, these articles have been coming out now for years, decades, and I'm not really seeing a systemic shift in response to that, even to the Me Too movement, or things like that. So it is a bit discouraging, but I'm hoping that listeners, will just, sometimes these are things that we have to like be talking about in our own communities, be the advocates within our little area of influence, so if you're a church leader, or if you're a community center leader, or if you're an educator in a school system, things like that, these are things to be aware of. But anyway, those are the topics we have for today. Lots of interesting things. Oh, on a positive note, probably people will say this is not so positive either, but the church did offer some of its shares back, its water shares, to the state of Utah to start, addressing this horrible issue that we have, the public health crisis, really, of water drought in this state, not to mention air quality. All those things are kind of interconnected. So there was a positive there. Again, I'm not sure why the church owns water shares to begin with, but that's a whole nother matter. But they did give some of them up back to the state of Utah. So hooray for that.
Yes. Thank you. The Great Salt Lake thanks you.
Yes. The Great Salt Lake hopefully is something that we can really start, focusing a lot of care and tender care too. So hopefully these snows that we keep on getting will be helpful to that as well. But I know it's going to take a lot more than 1 year of snow to fix this issue. So, all right, Michelle, thank you so much for joining me. If any of you are listening and there's a topic that you'd like for us to address, we do these panels once a month where we take into account anything that's in the intersection of religion, sexuality, deconstruction, reconstruction, that's kind of happening in the news, and things that we think people might be interested in having kind of a mental health perspective on. And we'd love to address any of those things that you tell us you'd like us to talk about. So have a good day, everybody. Have a good weekend. Today's March 24th of 2023. So have a good one.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Natasha Helfer Podcast. To help keep this podcast going, please consider donating at natashahelfer.com and share this episode. You can find Natasha on Facebook at Natasha Helfer, LCMFT, CSTS, and at Natasha Helfer MFT on Instagram and TikTok. You can find all her cool resources at natashahelfer.com. The intro and outro music for this episode is by Otter Creek. This podcast was edited by Ashley Pacini.
There is a place where time slows to nature's pace, and there is space there to find yourself in her embrace. Some places should be left alone. No tishki say the no, so we can always go to the homeland of the heart. Of our human history etched on her canyon walls, alongside Earth's mysteries. Some places should be left alone. No tishki say the no, so we can to the homeland of the heart, to the homeland of the heart. deep in our cities. We sleep without her stars, yet still her presence sustains us from afar. Some places should be left alone. So we can always go to the homeland of the heart, to the home